Welcome back. Welcome back to the third annual Glenn Symposium. We had a great session just before the lunch break, where we had our commercialization, finding the right balance panel. That was really good to have. Now we're going to present the AAS Macauley K. Macauley Award. The Macauley K. Macauley Award recognizes future space industry leaders by awarding and contributing to the professional development of a set of outstanding college and university students. 5 finalists and 1 winner were selected for each of the 2 tracks. One track was business and space policy, and the other track is science and engineering. The finalists are tuned into this event, and coming up, we'll have our first winner's presentation. The second winner will present on Thursday. Our 2021 Macauley Award winner for business and space policy is Alex Koenig. Alex is an undergraduate student in aeronautical and astronautical engineering and physics at the Massachusetts Institute of MIT. He's at MIT. Okay, Alex, please come and present your presentation to us. Go ahead, Alex. Bring up slides, please.
Should I be able to see the slides?
You should.
Okay.
Just a moment.
We'll go.
Wait. No rush.
Okay.
There they come. All right.
There we go. Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about space traffic management policy issues, and specifically what we can learn from recent efforts in the last decade or so from the FAA and their work on drone regulation in the national airspace system. Next slide, please. So space traffic management is kind of a growing issue. It hasn't been something that we've thought a lot about in the past because it hasn't been an issue in the past. But recently, especially with the rise of mega constellations and the increase of use in space in general, it is something we have to start to think about. So currently there's like roughly 20,000 known objects in orbit and upwards of millions of things that we don't necessarily track. And there's a general lack of precedent for maintaining the space environment. Again, this isn't something we've thought about that much. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, first, we're going to be characterizing each policy environment and their recent history. Firstly, the unmanned aerial system in the national airspace system environment, that's the acronym on the left, and the space traffic management policy environment. And we're going to look at how they're similar, how they're different, and see what ideas from the FAA's efforts that we might be able to apply to space traffic management. Next. So when I first present these ideas to people, I think they're rightfully a little skeptical because, after all, these environments are really different in overall volume, in number of objects in them. So it's not clear how they might apply. But through a simple physics model, we can kind of dispel those worries. So if we just look at what % of the environment each object traverses, and then the total number of objects in the environment, we can come up with numbers for roughly how likely collisions are. So comparing the national airspace system collisions and low Earth orbit collisions, it's roughly a 300 times difference, which is of course pretty big, but low Earth orbit is just that much bigger, but objects are moving much faster and there's many more of them. But when you think about it further, that number isn't all that different. If air traffic control were shut down for a single day, we would have many national disasters on our hands. Honestly, it would be better to ground every flight just from the get-go. But that's kind of the situation that is experienced on orbit every year, year on year. And that's why these kinds of policy considerations are so important. Next slide. So, unlike with the space environment, where essentially everything is allowed and there's no rules, the FAA started out with drones weren't allowed in the airspace at all, and it's converging to some middle ground, which is reasonable on both sides. But in 2012, the FAA introduced their first kind of UAS policy, which started to allow flights in the airspace system. But this was a really low volume of flights, on average 4 per day, which is really minimal compared to the 50,000 total. And so in 2016, they started to update these rules to allow more efficient case-by-case approval processes. And in tandem with that came registration for each vehicle, as well as pilot licensing in some cases. Next bullet point. And then in 2020, along with rules introduced simultaneously for manned aircraft as part of a system-wide update, they started requiring remote identification on each unmanned aerial system, which essentially broadcasts the position of that vehicle to all users of the environment. And then currently the FAA is looking at allowing beyond visual line of sight operations, which will allow more autonomous flights, as well as routine and schedule operations, so graduating from the case-by-case approval process into a more regimented one. In the future, that will allow industries like package delivery, large cargo transport, and in the distant future, maybe even autonomous passenger flights. Next. In contrast with the National Airspace System policy environment, the space policy environment is pretty sparse. The Department of Commerce is the civil agency responsible for STM policymaking. And although they're currently conducting studies to see what next steps they should take, there's really no effectual on-orbit policies to date. There are optional guidelines, such as the NASA orbital debris mitigation standard practices. The most often quoted one is the 25-year rule, which dictates when a satellite should deorbit following the end of its operational lifetime. And there's my personal favorite, operator-led STM, which is essentially just initiatives for common sense kinds of things, like not putting your spacecraft in a heavily trafficked orbit, performing collision avoidance maneuvers when you think something might be coming up, as well as organizations such as the Space Data Association, where you can share your spacecraft locations with other users of space, so you know you won't hit each other. Next. So in each case, safe integration of vehicles into the environment is really challenging, and it's hard to do well. It's also not totally clear how it's going to work. But in FAA's case, they have made it work, so there is hope. In each case, operators are inclined to act in their own best interest, which is to be expected, but also means that coordination on a large scale can be really difficult. This is exacerbated in the case of space because it's really an international effort. It's not just us, it's not just our airspace to do what we want with it. And so as a result, direct regulations are really not the complete answer to these issues, as we'll see. Next slide, please. So at least to start off with, we can see what the FAA has done with drones. It's their primary mode of operation. It's what they know best. So let's take a few lessons from them, see what works. So in general, their rules tend to follow those of manned aircraft. They're a little more stringent to date, just because the technology is still in development. But where they can be applied, they tend to work well. The issue is just that the rules aren't necessarily all followed, and they can be hard to impose. Say a user of a drone is operating next to an airport illegally. Sure, that's, it's not allowed by law, but that fact alone doesn't stop the fact that it's a hazard to the environment and that the airport probably needs to be shut down as a result. Next slide. So for the space environment, these kinds of regulations are just not very palatable. They're really expensive in the case of space. They can be burdensome on industry, which is especially harmful to small growing businesses, and since the industry is just starting to develop itself. But there is a possible route forward. The FAA already requires launch licensing, which takes into account environmental effects nearby the launch site. And maybe we could classify space traffic management as a similar environmental effort, except for not just near the launch site, but also in space as well. And so we have specific ideas from UAS efforts, such as requiring remote identification of spacecraft, requiring that their information is shared, as well as for things like making sure the spacecraft is deorbited following its end of lifetime. Next slide, please. So the FAA had to come up with more creative solutions to the issue of drone regulation as well. So instead of just imposing rules on operators, they approached manufacturers as well, relying on the fact that manufacturers know that the responsible use of their products is key to their own success. Otherwise, they might just be banned outright. So certain operators have really gone, certain manufacturers have really gone above and beyond in this manner. such as like imposing geofencing on their products, which is totally on their own initiative. But essentially that means that the drones are physically incapable of flying into restricted airspace without prior approval. Next slide. And similarly for space traffic management, we could approach not only manufacturers, but potentially even launch providers as well, and just ask them to consider similar things like, are spacecrafts detectable in space? You know, do they have deorbit capabilities? Can they perform collision avoidance maneuvers? Do you know whether the people that are buying your products are going to use them in a responsible manner? And so these are all kinds of the initiatives we might expect or request from both manufacturers and launch providers. Next slide. And in a more broad sense, one of the FAA's strengths with the drone regulation environment is that there's a really strong pre-existing safety culture in the aviation community. The challenge for them was that the drone community is pretty disparate, and they had to figure out how to connect to those communities so that you know, they could take advantage of that. And so one of the things they started to do is provide operator licensing. In some cases, this is required, say if you're a commercial entity. In other cases, it's just for fun, or it's for additional benefits, such as being able to fly in airspaces where otherwise you might not be able to. And they also perform drone safety education and outreach, which is kind of an ongoing effort. Next slide. Similarly for STM, we could incentivize safety-related practices. And one of the really nice things here is that this doesn't necessarily have to be policy-driven. You know, we can make users of space want to be proactive and perform sustainably, which I think is really exciting. And although there's not necessarily a really strong safety culture to start out with, there are other fields that are close by which we can rely on. In particular, what comes to mind is the human space exploration field, which does have a strong safety culture. So maybe we could recruit their expertise, get their advice. And there are ongoing efforts in this particular point, although they're kind of few and far in between. My favorite example is the space sustainability rating, which is also kind of a badge of honor. And it just highlights those players in the space community that go above and beyond in their efforts to act in a sustainable manner. And that's in development by the World Economic Forum, but hopefully we'll see that deployed soon. Next slide. And I think it's also really important to learn not from what was just done well, but from what could have been done better. And although obviously the FAA has done a very good job with drone regulation, otherwise I wouldn't be making this presentation, but there are things which they could have done better, perhaps. And in particular, the burdensome certification and approval processes and the case-by-case approvals probably wouldn't fly in space. Space is a growing industry. It's already very expensive. And we don't want to see, especially like small businesses that don't necessarily have all the resources, not be able to fly. And similarly, where the technology is capable of achieving certain things, we don't want the policy considerations to prohibit that. That would just be really disappointing to see. And that has been kind of the case in the drone world. Although obviously the FAA has just been playing it very safe because there are human lives at stake in that case. But overall, I think there's lots we can learn from FAA drone regulations. And this presentation has mainly just looked at, zoomed in on a key few ideas that I think are particularly interesting. That's all.
Alex, thank you so very much. This has really helped us look at the continuum of the opportunity and the problems from aircraft to UASs to spacecraft. So thank you very much. And I personally appreciate the way you've addressed it. All right, folks, now our next session starts in about 15 or 20 seconds. That's going to be the really remote working. Jim Way will take you on the other side of a 15-second break. So go ahead and switch over to the next session. Thank you very much.